It's, the rabbit on my profile picture says live on it. But considering that that picture of that rabbit was taken about 30 years ago or so, I doubt that rabbit is still alive. Hi. Hello. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you may happen to be in, whichever time zone you may happen to be in. I am Tad. I am back after taking last week off. As I explained in my, yeah, I know many of you, since you are here regularly and you sort of know a lot of what's going on in my life because I'm always babbling on about it. So many, if not all of you, if not most of you anyway, know that we had to euthanize our beloved Chihuahua, Walter, who started to go downhill really over Christmas and just kind of very quickly went through kind of a complete system collapse. We still don't really know what it was, but he had a lot of issues. He had been on phenobarbital for several years for epilepsy and things like that. And he had just completely pretty much lost his ability to walk and to get around on his own. So for the last week or so, week and a half, we were kind of carrying him around everywhere and holding him over his water bowl and all kinds of things. And it was clear that he just was not, able to have his doggy life anymore, which of course is heartbreaking. But he was with us for a very long time and gave us wonderful companionship. He was hilarious and crazy and fun, and we miss him like hell. But that was not why I took last week off, as I think I also said in an answer to somebody online. Normally I would welcome the chance to make contact with people. And in fact, when my mom died, I believe I was on within a few days after that. I don't exactly remember for certain because that was back in the summer of 22. But I know that, I was glad to have the virtual company and have something to do. So that was not the reason I missed last week, much as we all loved Walter, who I probably may talk again about a little bit at some point. Johnny, by the way, is holding up very well under the circumstances. I think he was very uncomfortable with Walter over much of the last year because he was so different from how he had used to be. He was Johnny's boss because he was the older dog, and despite the massive difference in their sizes, Walter always was the boss. And when he was upset with Johnny about something, he would leap up and fasten his little teeth on Johnny's jowl and hang on him, and Johnny would just kind of stand there like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. So, but then Walter really started to go downhill a year ago or so, where he first kind of lost his ability to walk well and things like that. Not anywhere near as bad as he did, obviously, in the last week or two. But anyway, and so Johnny was very uncomfortable with that, and I think Walter was also deaf, and so when Walter would sort of come stumbling up to Johnny when Johnny was lying on the bed, Johnny just didn't get what was going on because he would growl to say kind of like, wait, hang on, you're freaking me out. And Walter, of course, didn't hear him. So it was, excuse me, it was a complicated internal dynamic in the family. So Johnny appears to be pretty much okay. I mean, we also brought him with us so that after it was all over and Walter had been given the shots and all that stuff and had finally his little heart had stopped and all those kinds of things, so that Johnny would be there and could sniff him and understand what had happened instead of Walter just disappearing from the household. But anyway, I started off to explain why I wasn't here last week. So just within a few days after that, and at first I thought perhaps stress related, I just had this huge thing where my face just was like, and very red, and just, like I assumed it was eczema, which I sometimes get. But it was, really, it started up here and went all the way around all my facial features. It was hot and itchy and miserable, and it hurt. I did not particularly feel capable of choking my way through a reading. Interestingly, though, I now know no, this is not. This is exactly what happened to me the last time. I am now convinced. I was confused about the time of the year, and because I had something like this happen once before, which was a reaction, like an anaphylactic reaction to a tick bite. And I think that's what this was this time too. And it was quite dramatic. I mean, it was like for several days, I looked like, I don't know, the Phantom of the Opera or something. It was pretty grim. And then I hope this is not grossing anybody out. I'm trying to stay away from anything too unpleasant. But then it was like I'd had a really bad sunburn and all the skin had just died around, my mouth, nose, eyes, eyebrows, all of that stuff. And it just like fell away. It just peeled, like, again, like a bad sunburn, which kills the top layer of skin and then it just dies and falls away. That's kind of what happened. Anyway, so if I've now thoroughly grossed everybody out, but that's why I wasn't here last week. I was in fairly wretched shape. Not so much emotionally because, this is what happens when you're an animal person. You know that. I mean, I can sit down and count through them, but I mean, I have outlived so many pets, every one of them a beloved member of the family. And that's just how it goes, and you have to get used to it. And unlike, say, losing someone that you expect will outlive you, like the horror of a parent losing a child or something, I mean, we kind of know, unless you adopt a Galapagos tortoise or, a Greenland shark or, something like that. Salmon shark, I don't know, whichever the one is that lives like 400 years. Unless you adopt one of those as a pet, you pretty much know that the time is going to come when you are going to have to make that pretty painful decision. And you just hope you get the timing right and that you give them as much life as they can enjoy, and then you recognize when it's not good for them anymore. Anyway, so enough of sad topics. What else is going on? Working away on the Splintered Sun, and that is kind of now feels like it's beginning to get some rhythm again after a very disruptive last few weeks over the holidays and everything that goes with the holidays, and then of course Walter's severe decline and all that stuff, and me having my face essentially caught on fire and somebody put it out with a croquet mallet. That's what I looked like for several days. So more or less back to work now, and things more or less normal. Anything else? Yeah, I mean, like I said, Johnny's doing okay. He certainly is glad he doesn't have to fight for the right to hog the bed anymore. And as long as the treats and everything keep coming regularly, he seems like, okay, I can deal with it. The rest of us, of course, very, moments of great forlornness and sadness. I particularly miss the sound that Walter always, his nails grew really fast, and cutting them was always a huge hassle because he would scream like he was being murdered, and it made Johnny really nervous. So we had to take Walter downstairs to the dungeon, down here to this office, and cut his nails down here where the screams couldn't upset Johnny quite so much. This is just getting his nails cut. This is not us doing him any damage or cutting too close to the quick or anything. I mean, but anyway, but Walter, because he always had long nails and he was such a busy little dog, he was always, you could hear him all over the house going tick, 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 because he just covered so much ground. He was always in motion. He was, to use a perfect word that really describes him, he was peripatetic. He just was always doing things and always had important business. He was always racing around doing good, is how we used to phrase it, from a stolen from a Stevie Smith poem, and about a cat. But it was very true of Walter. He was always racing around, running around, doing good, or thought he was anyway. So anyway, before I start reading, because we are still reading, and we are still reading the Martian Chronicles, let me check in and see who has popped in and said hello. I see there's Petra. Hello. Guten Morgen, I guess. Yeah. Nikki. Hello, Nikki. Ivan, my old China. Me old China. For those of you who don't know, by the way, I know the English folks out there know, me old China is Cockney rhyming slang for me old China plate, mate, me old mate. Anyway, Ilva, hello, darling. I have your thing, and I will respond to it. The possible tattoo drawing, and I will respond to that probably tomorrow at this rate. Christina, hello, good to see you. Sandra, a pleasure as always. Suzanne, good to have you with me. Isaac, hello. Chris, thank you, sir, for all your work, and good to see you. Wouter, same. Iris, good to see you too. Rosalba, pleasure. Mark, checking in from Yorkshire. Christy, hello, Christy. Nicole, Carol, and I think the last was Penny. Yes, Penny. So hello, good to see you all. Anyway, so nice to have you with me. A pleasure, as always, to share some time with you. And with that, I am going to start reading if I can find what I have here. Yes, it would be the Kindle here. I think I read some of this one, but by the time I got my act together tonight, I forgot to go back and check and see how far I'd read. So I'm just going to start it from scratch here. This story is called The Silent Towns. It's dated December 2036. It's so funny. When Bradbury wrote this, he must have thought how impossibly far in the future that is. And I'm looking at it and going, 11 years. It's 11 years from now. It's not the science fiction future anymore, except to those of us who were, around to be conscious in the middle of the 20th century. Then it does begin to seem rather science fiction-y. Anyway, December 2036, The Silent Towns. There was a little white silent town on the edge of the dead Martian Sea. Oh, by the way, for those of you who may not remember, what has just happened is a war is just beginning on Earth, and there has been apparently an exchange of some kind of nuclear weapons. We don't really know what happened, but we know that a war has started on Earth at this point. There was a little white silent town on the edge of the dead Martian Sea. The town was empty. No one moved in it. Lonely lights burned in the stores all day. The shop doors were wide, as if people had run off without using their keys. Magazines, brought from Earth on the Silver Rocket a month before, fluttered untouched, burning brown on wire racks fronting the silent drugstores. The town was dead. Its beds were empty and cold. The only sound was the power hum of electric lines and dynamos, still alive all by themselves. Water ran in forgotten bathtubs, poured out into living rooms, onto porches, and down through little garden plots to feed neglected flowers. In the dark theaters, gum under the many seats began to harden, with tooth impressions still in it. Across town was a rocket port. You could still smell the hard, scorched smell where the last rocket blasted off when it went back to Earth. If you dropped a dime in the telescope and pointed it at Earth, perhaps you could see the big war happening there. Perhaps you could see New York explode. Maybe London could be seen covered with a new kind of fog. Perhaps then it might be understood why this small Martian town is abandoned. How quick was the evacuation? Walk in any store, bang the no sale key. Cash drawers jump out all bright and jingly with coins. That war on Earth must be very bad. Along the empty avenues of this town, now, whistling softly, kicking a tin can ahead of him in deepest concentration, came a tall, thin man. His eyes glowed with a dark, quiet look of loneliness. He moved his bony hands in his pockets, which were tinkling with new dimes. Occasionally, he tossed a dime to the ground. He laughed temperately, doing this, and walked on, sprinkling bright dimes everywhere. His name was Walter Grip. He had a placer mine and a remote shack far up in the blue Martian hills, and he walked to town once every 2 weeks to see if he could marry a quiet and intelligent woman. Over the years, he had always returned to his shack alone and disappointed. A week ago, arriving in town, he had found it this way. That day he had been so surprised that he rushed to a delicatessen, flung wide a case, and ordered a triple-decker beef sandwich. "Coming up," he cried, a towel on his arm. He flourished meats and bread baked the day before, dusted a table, invited himself to sit, and ate until he had to go find a soda fountain, where he ordered a bicarbonate. The druggist, being one Walter Grip, was astoundingly polite and fizzed one right up for him. He stuffed his jeans with money, all he could find. He loaded a boy's wagon with $10 bills and ran lickety-split through town. Reaching the suburbs, he suddenly realized how shamefully silly he was. He didn't need money. He rode the $10 bills back to where he'd found them, counted $1 from his own wallet to pay for the sandwiches, dropped it in the delicatessen till, and added a quarter tip. That night, he enjoyed a hot Turkish bath, a succulent fillet carpeted with delicate mushrooms, imported dry sherry, and strawberries in wine. He fitted himself for a new blue flannel suit and a rich gray Homburg, which balanced oddly atop his gaunt head. He slid money into a jukebox, which played That Old Gang of Mine. He dropped nickels in 20 boxes all over town. The lonely streets and the night were full of the sad music of That Old Gang of Mine as he walked, tall and thin and alone, his new shoes clumping softly, his cold hands in his pockets. But that was a week past. He slept in a good house on Mars Avenue, rose mornings at 9, bathed, and idled to town for ham and eggs. No morning passed that he didn't freeze a ton of meats, vegetables, and lemon cream pies, enough to last 10 years, until the rockets came back from Earth, if they ever came. Now, tonight, he drifted up and down, seeing the wax women in every colorful shop window, pink and beautiful. For the first time, he knew how dead the town was. He drew a glass of beer and sobbed gently. "Why?" he said. "I'm all alone." He entered the elite theater to show himself a film, to distract his mind from his isolation. The theater was hollow, empty, like a tomb with phantoms crawling gray and black on the vast screen. Shivering, he hurried from the haunted place. Having decided to return home, he was striking down the middle of a side street, almost running, when he heard the phone. He listened. Phone ringing in someone's house. He proceeded briskly. "Someone should answer that phone," he mused. He sat on a curb to pick a rock from his shoe idly. "Someone!" he screamed, leaping. "Me! Good Lord, what's wrong with me?" he shrieked. He whirled. "Which house?" "That one." He raced over the lawn, up the steps, into the house, down a dark hall. He yanked up the receiver. "Hello?" he cried. "Buzz! Hello! Hello!" They had hung up. "Hello!" he shouted and banged the phone. "You stupid idiot!" he cried to himself. "Sitting on that curb! You fool! Oh, you damned and awful fool!" He squeezed the phone. "Come on, ring again! Come on!" He had never thought there might be others left on Mars. In the entire week, he had seen no one. He had figured that all the other towns were as empty as this one. Now, staring at this terrible little black phone, he trembled. Interlocking dial systems connected every town on Mars. From which of the 30 cities had the call come? He didn't know. He waited. He wandered to the strange kitchen, thawed some iced huckleberries, ate them disconsolately. "There wasn't anyone on the other end of that call," he murmured. "Maybe a pole blew down somewhere and the phone rang by itself." But he hadn't heard a click, which meant someone had hung up far away. He stood in the hall the rest of the night. "Not because of the phone," he told himself. "I just haven't anything else to do." He listened to his watch tick. "She won't phone back," he said. She won't ever call a number that didn't answer. She's probably dialing other houses in town right now, and here I sit. Wait a minute, he laughed. Why do I keep saying she? He blinked. It could as easily be a he, couldn't it? His heart slowed. He felt very cold and hollow. He wanted very much for it to be a she. He walked out of the house and stood in the center of the early, dim morning street. He listened. Not a sound. No birds. No cars. Only his heart beating. Beat and pause and beat again. His face ached with strain. The wind blew gently, oh, so gently, flapping his coat. Shh, he whispered. Listen. He swayed in a slow circle, turning his head from one silent house to another. She'll phone more and more numbers, he thought. It must be a woman. Why? Only a woman would call and call. A man wouldn't. A man's independent. Did I phone anyone? No. Never thought of it. It must be a woman. It has to be, by God. Listen. Far away, under the stars, a phone rang. He ran. He stopped to listen. The ringing, soft. He ran a few more steps, louder. He raced down an alley. Louder still. He passed 6 houses, 6 more, much louder. He chose a house and its door was locked. The phone rang inside. Damn you! He jerked the doorknob. The phone screamed. He heaved a porch chair through the parlor window, leaped in after it. Before he even touched the phone, it was silent. He stalked through the house then and broke mirrors, tore down drapes, and kicked in the kitchen stove. Finally, exhausted, he picked up the thin directory which listed every phone on Mars, 50,000 names. He started with number 1, Amelia Ames. He dialed her number in New Chicago, 100 miles over the Dead Sea. No answer. Number 2 lived in New York, 5,000 miles across the Blue Mountains. No answer. He called 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, his fingers jerking, unable to grip the receiver. A woman's voice, answered. Hello? Walter cried back at her, Hello! Oh, Lord, hello! This is a recording, recited the woman's voice. Miss Helen Arasumian is not home. Will you leave a message on the answering machine so she may call you when she returns? Hello? This is a recording. Miss Arasumian is not home. Will you leave a message? He hung up. He sat with his mouth twitching. On second thought, he redialed that number. When Miss Helen Arasumian comes home, he said, tell her to go to hell. He phoned Mars Junction, New Boston, Arcadia, and Roosevelt City exchanges, theorizing that they would be logical places for persons to dial from. After that, he contacted local city halls and other public institutions in each town. He phoned the best hotels. Leave it to a woman to put herself up in luxury. Suddenly he stopped, clapped his hands sharply together, and laughed. Of course! He checked the directory and dialed a long-distance call through to the biggest beauty parlor in New Texas City. If ever there was a place where a woman would putter around, patting mud packs on her face and sitting under a dryer, it would be a velvet-soft diamond gem beauty parlor. The phone rang. Someone at the other end lifted the receiver. A woman's voice said, Hello? If this is a recording, announced Walter Grip, I'll come over and blow the place up. This isn't a record, said the woman's voice. Hello. Oh, hello, there is someone alive. Where are you? She gave a delighted scream. Walter almost collapsed. You! He stood up jerkily, eyes wild. Good Lord, what luck? What's your name? Genevieve Seltzer. She wept into the receiver. I'm so glad to hear from you, whoever you are. Walter Grip. Walter. Hello, Walter. Hello, Genevieve. Walter. It's such a nice name. Walter. Walter. Thank you. Walter, where are you? Her voice was so kind and sweet and fine. By the way, a brief thing. I did not realize when I knew I'd be reading this story tonight, I completely forgot that the main character's name is Walter, which is a bizarre bit of coincidence. Walter, where are you? Her voice was so kind and sweet and fine. He held the phone tight to his ear so she could whisper sweetly into it. He felt his feet drift off the floor. His cheeks burned. I'm in Marlin Village, he said. Hello? He said. He jiggled the hook. Nothing. Somewhere, a wind had blown down a pole. As quickly as she had come, Genevieve Seltzer was gone. He dialed, but the line was dead. I know where she is anyway. He ran out of the house. The sun was rising as he backed a Beetle car from the stranger's garage, filled its back seat with food from the house, and set out at 80 miles an hour down the highway, heading for New Texas City. 1,000 miles, he thought. Genevieve Seltzer, sit tight. You'll hear from me. He honked his horn on every turn out of town. At sunset, after an impossible day of driving, he pulled to the roadside, kicked off his tight shoes, laid himself out in the seat, and slid the gray Homburg over his weary eyes. His breathing became slow and regular. The wind blew and the stars shone gently upon him in the new dusk. The Martian mountains lay all around, millions of years old. Starlight glittered on the spires of a little Martian town, no bigger than a game of chess in the blue hills. He lay in the half place between awakeness and dreams. He whispered, Genevieve. Oh, Genevieve, sweet Genevieve, he sang softly. The years may come, the years may go, but Genevieve, sweet Genevieve. There was a warmth in him. He heard her quiet, sweet, cool voice sighing, Hello. Oh, hello, Walter. This is no record. Where are you, Walter? Where are you? He sighed, putting a hand up to touch her in the moonlight. Long, dark hair shaking in the wind. Beautiful it was. And her lips like red peppermints. And her cheeks like fresh-cut wet roses. And her body like a clear, vaporous mist, while her cool, soft, sweet voice crooned to him once more the words to the old sad song. Oh, Genevieve, sweet Genevieve, the years may come, the years may go. He slept. He reached New Texas City at midnight. He halted before the deluxe beauty salon, yelling. He expected her to rush out, all perfume, all laughter. Nothing happened. She's asleep. He walked to the door. Here I am! He called, Hello, Genevieve! The town lay in double moonlit silence. Somewhere a wind flapped a canvas awning. He swung the glass door wide and stepped in. Hey! He laughed uneasily. Don't hide. I know you're here. He searched every booth. He found a tiny handkerchief on the floor. It smelled so good he almost lost his balance. Genevieve, he said. He drove the car through the empty streets, but saw nothing. If this is a practical joke, he slowed the car. Wait a minute, we were cut off. Maybe she drove to Marlin Village while I was driving here. She probably took the old sea road. We missed each other during the day. How did she know I'd come get her? I didn't say I would. And she was so afraid when the phone died that she rushed to Marlin Village to find me. And here I am. By God, what a fool I am. Giving the horn a blow, he shot out of town. He drove all night. He thought, what if she isn't in Marlin Village waiting when I arrive? He wouldn't think of that. She must be there, and he would run up and hold her and perhaps even kiss her once on the lips. Genevieve, sweet Genevieve, he whistled, stepping it up to 100 miles an hour. Marlin Village was quiet at dawn. Yellow lights were still burning in several stores, and a jukebox that had played steadily for 100 hours finally, with a crackle of electricity, ceased, making the silence complete. The sun warmed the streets and warmed the cold and vacant sky. Walter turned down Main Street, the car lights still on, honking the horn a double toot, 6 times at one corner, 6 times at another. He peered at the store names. His face was white and tired, and his hands slid on the sweaty steering wheel. "Genevieve!" he called in the empty street. The door to a beauty salon opened. "Genevieve!" He stopped the car. Genevieve Seltzer stood in the open door of the salon as he ran across the street. A box of cream chocolates lay open in her arms. Her fingers, cuddling it, were plump and pallid. Her face, as she stepped into the light, was round and thick, and her eyes were like 2 immense eggs stuck into a white mess of bread dough. Her legs were as big around as the stumps of trees, and she moved with an ungainly shuffle. Her hair was an indiscriminate shade of brown that had been made and remade, it appeared, as a nest for birds. She had no lips at all, and compensated this by stenciling on a large, red, greasy mouth that now popped open in delight, now shut in sudden alarm. She had plucked her brows to thin antenna lines. Walter stopped. His smile dissolved. He stood looking at her. She dropped her candy box to the sidewalk. "Are you Genevieve Seltzer?" His ears rang. "Are you Walter Griff?" she asked. "Grip. Grip," she corrected herself. "How do you do?" he said with a restrained voice. "How do you do?" She shook his hand. Her fingers were sticky with chocolate. "Well," said Walter Grip. "What?" asked Genevieve Seltzer. "I just said, well," said Walter. "Oh." It was 9 o'clock at night. They had spent the day picnicking, and for supper he had prepared a filet mignon, which she didn't like because it was too rare. So he broiled it some more, and it was too much broiled or fried or something. He laughed and said, "We'll see a movie." She said okay and put her chocolatey fingers on his elbow, but all she wanted to see was an 80-year-old film of Clark Gable. "Doesn't he just kill you?" she giggled. "Doesn't he kill you now?" The film ended. "Run it off again," she commanded. "Again?" he asked. "Again," she said, and when he returned, she snuggled up and put her paws all over him. "You're not quite what I expected, but you're nice," she admitted. "Thanks," he said, swallowing. "Oh, that Gable," she said, and pinched his leg. "Ouch," he said. After the film, they went shopping down the silent streets. She broke a window and put on the brightest dress she could find. Dumping a perfume bottle on her hair, she resembled a drowned sheepdog. "How old are you?" he inquired. "Guess." Dripping, she led him down the street. 30, he said. "Well," she announced stiffly, "I'm only 27, so there." "Here's another candy store," she said. "Honest, I've led the life of Riley since everything exploded. I never liked my folks. They were fools. They left for Earth 2 months ago. I was supposed to follow on the last rocket, but I stayed on. You know why?" "Why?" "Because everyone picked on me. So I stayed where I could throw perfume on myself all day and drink 10,000 malts and eat candy without people saying, Oh, that's full of calories. So here I am. Here you are. Walter shut his eyes. It's getting late, she said, looking at him. Yes, I'm tired, she said. Funny, I'm wide awake. Oh, she said. I feel like staying up all night, he said. Say, there's a good record at Mike's. Come on, I'll play it for you. I'm tired. She glanced up at him with sly, bright eyes. I'm very alert, he said. Strange. Come back to the beauty shop, she said. I want to show you something. She took him in through the glass door and walked him over to a large white box. When I drove from Texas City, she said, I brought this with me. She untied the pink ribbon. I thought, well, here I am, the only lady on Mars, and here is the only man, and, well, she lifted the lid and folded back crisp layers of whispery pink tissue paper. She gave it a pat. There. Walter Grip stared. What is it? He asked, beginning to tremble. Don't you know, silly? It's all lace and all white and all fine and everything. No, I don't know what it is. It's a wedding dress, silly. Is it? His voice cracked. He shut his eyes. Her voice was still soft and cool and sweet as it had been on the phone, but when he opened his eyes and looked at her, he backed up. How nice, he said. Isn't it? Genevieve, he glanced at the door. Yes? Genevieve, I've something to tell you. Yes? She drifted toward him, the perfume smell thick about her round white face. The thing I have to say to you is, he said. Yes? Goodbye. And he was out of the door and into his car before she could scream. She ran and stood on the curb as he swung the car about. Walter Griff, come back here, she wailed, flinging up her arms. Grip, he corrected her. Grip, she shouted. The car whirled away down the silent street, regardless of her stompings and shriekings. The exhaust from it fluttered the white dress she crumpled in her plump hands, and the stars shone bright, and the car vanished out onto the desert and away into blackness. He drove all night and all day for 3 nights and days. Once he thought he saw a car following, and he broke into a shivering sweat and took another highway, cutting off across the lonely Martian world, past little dead cities, and he drove and drove for a week and a day until he had put 10,000 miles between himself and Marlin Village. Then he pulled into a small town named Holtville Springs, where there were some tiny stores he could light up at night and restaurants to sit in, ordering meals. And he's lived there ever since, with 2 deep freezes packed with food to last him 100 years, and enough cigars to last 10,000 days, and a good bed with a soft mattress. And when once in a while, over the long years, the phone rings, he doesn't answer. And that's the end of that story, which is very interesting for a number of reasons. One of them is, I think in one way, one of the interesting things is that, like many other people, Bradbury, like many other people, and especially many people in the arts, I think, Bradbury definitely changed as he went through the 60s and 70s. And what you see, especially in some of these stories that were written early on, probably primarily in the 50s, is, again, that very, as I said, he was never trying to create a believable future in the sense that, the predictive sense that a lot of science fiction tries to adopt. He was essentially writing about the America that he knew and transplanting it to Mars. I talked, I think, a couple of weeks ago about the indigenes, the indigenous peoples, in this case the Martians, but in America, obviously, the indigenous people were the Indians, the Native Americans. And that idea had very much sunk into Bradbury by the time. And by the way, the version of the Martian Chronicles that I had, now that I think about it, actually had a story in it that isn't in this edition, which I hadn't even realized until just this moment. And I can't think of the name of it. It may have been called Way in the Middle of the Air, but it was basically about a black sharecroppers who were being told that they had to stay and work on the farm and that they owed the farm money and all this stuff. And that several of them who wanted to leave were eventually able to leave and get on rockets to go to Mars. So even in the 50s and I think in the early 60s, it's interesting that that's not in this collection. I wonder why that decision was made to take it out. I don't recall it being embarrassing, except in the sense that, no, it wasn't particularly embarrassing. It was an attempt to deal with things from a non-racist point of view. Recognizing the wrongness of racism and of particularly the Jim Crow South of the time. But interestingly enough, that's not in this edition. And I just realized just this moment. But the thing that I wanted to bring up is where Bradbury had already in the 50s begun to take on or had as a native component of his personality and his understanding of the world that racial relations were an issue, and they were an ugly, contentious issue in America at the time. Me particularly with this story and some of the earlier stories, like the one about the young women waiting for a phone call from Mars and trying to make a decision if they were going to follow this young woman in particular, if she was going to try to follow her boyfriend to Mars. So what's interesting is that even though Bradbury showed evidence back in the 50s of kind of getting that race relations were a thing that were more and more central in American life and the American debate over where the country should go, but and later on in his fiction in the 80s and 90s and later, much more fleshed out female characters and much more of an assumption that women and men, while different, are not that different. But a lot of the Martian Chronicles stories, as you can see, were written where he had not quite reached that stage with his female characters. And so the kind of the response that the main character has in the story we just read is not merely that of a man of that era, that like a 40s and 50s guy, realizing that he doesn't want to spend the rest of his life with this woman whom he had, confected a self for that was nothing like what she really was. But it also kind of echoes that very common thing which you see in a lot of fiction of that era, in television, in movies, certainly in science fiction as well, which is the idea that women are essentially, or a lot of women are out to trap men into some kind of a relationship. That very 40s and 50s thing about, I got to get me a man, that whole Sadie Hawkins Day thing. And one of the flaws with the story, as far as I'm concerned, but an interesting thing to think about, is that the whole idea of it is so terrifying to that 50s male ideation that that this guy would rather be lonely for the rest of his life than say, I don't necessarily feel like we should be a couple, but we could be friends and acquaintances, But it's very much that 50s, 40s and 50s thing of all or nothing, that women are going to try and shackle you in a relationship, and so if you're not interested in them, you have to escape. This is dealt with in much more harmless fashion in things like P.G. Wodehouse, where women are forever trying to marry Bertie Wooster, and he's always having to have Jeeves help him get out of it somehow. But it's interesting that, that here Bradbury, who gave evidence in this period of his writing that he was already aware of other kinds of societal imbalances and unkindnesses and things like that, had not yet made the connection that women were a bit more complex than what he was thinking. And it's not by any means just Bradbury. I mean, it's really interesting. Almost every writer of that period, every male writer of that period, when I read even the ones that are trying their best to, I'm thinking about like Stranger in a Strange Land, where Heinlein is trying very hard to create these impressive women who are smart and take no guff and blah, blah, blah. But there's still all of these early 20th century unquestioned ideas that are bubbling underneath. And there is always this kind of unspoken certainty that when it comes down to things, men have to solve them. And even Theodore Sturgeon, for instance, who by later life was a much more kind of open-minded, almost kind of like, hippie, open-minded, like anything is possible kind of a guy. But in some of his early ones, like I think the story I read to you, the one about the young woman who is just found out that she has breast cancer, and the guy essentially cures her of it. And even there, though, this whole thing is kind of like this man defending himself and defending his freedom and his autonomy from a woman who potentially is going to take that freedom away from him by loving him and becoming attached to him. So, for instance, as a, modern writer, I think it would have been much more interesting if they met and were somewhat attracted to each other, but just ultimately, I'm talking about the story we just finished reading. If they met and were somewhat attracted to each other, but there just wasn't a whole lot there, instead of her actually being what to this character was an unacceptable, impossible object. And in fact, she is very much turned into an object, the character of Genevieve, which even at one point he refers to her hand as a paw and things like that. So, the poor woman never had a chance in this story. She is an object of almost fear, almost terror, on the part of the male character. Anyway, just wanted to mention a few of those things because I thought they were rather interesting. And because a book like this was very important to me does not mean that everything in it is something that I go like, this is exactly perfect. It's not. It's I taught a college course once called Point of Regard, and my whole premise was basically that science fiction is almost never about the future. It's almost always about the period in which it's written, the culture in which it's written, the prevailing beliefs of the culture and of the writer, and they are transposed or projected onto an imaginary future, which is one of the things that's wonderful about science fiction. It becomes a very personal vehicle for the writers to talk about contemporary things, but with the advantage of being able to exaggerate them or examine just small particular aspects of them. But anyway, so I did this particular, what's the word I'm looking for? Taught this class at Stanford, and took books like, I think I actually had Stranger in a Strange Land was one of them.
Neuromancer was another one as an example of the 80s cyber thing and the kind of prevailing 80s idea that society was on its way to collapse, and et cetera, and a few others. I can't remember offhand. There were two other books that we read as well. But they were all with this idea of these books are products of the time in which they were written, and that the whole idea of them being an examination of a possible future is largely illusory. It's a lens through which the present can be examined. And when I wrote the Other Land books, which I've been hearing about for years, in terms of people kindly saying to me, "Oh my God, you predicted this, or you predicted that, or look at this is happening," just like you said in Other Land. And as I have told people before, I did not set out to predict anything in the Other Land books. What I tried to do, and what my aim was in all of these future things, especially the things that show up in what's called the net feed sections at the beginning of each chapter, I was essentially taking things I saw in newspapers. You may remember newspapers. In the newspapers of the time and magazines of the time, talking about contemporary trends and just satirizing them by extending them and increasing them or emphasizing them until they became parodies, until they were ridiculous. And they were all pretty much extrapolations from what was happening at that time and that I was reading about or learning about or hearing about or seeing on television in the 90s in England, which is where I was living because I had just moved to London to be with Deborah. So, excuse me, even in my own case with my own science fiction novels, I was not trying to say, I think this is what what the future is going to really be like, excuse me, so much as I was saying, this is where we're going. And if we don't change, this is the absurd stuff of today that is going to become even more absurd later on. So anyway, a long digression on a series of things. I hope that didn't bore any of you too much. I am trying to think about whether I should start the next story. It's a fairly long one. And then after that comes the last two stories, which are my favorites in the series. In the Martian Chronicles, There Will Come Soft Rains, and I can't remember what the last one's called. All right, so shall I start that? I'll read a few pages of it. I'll read a few pages because we've got about 7 minutes left. April 2057. So this is now 21 years after the last story. April 2057, The Long Years. Whenever the wind came through the sky, he and his small family would sit in the stone hut and warm their hands over a wood fire. The wind would stir the canal waters and almost blow the stars out of the sky, but Mr. Hathaway would sit contented and talk to his wife, and his wife would reply, and he would speak to his two daughters and his son about the old days on Earth, and they would all answer neatly. It was the 20th year after the Great War. Mars was a tomb planet. Whether or not Earth was the same was a matter for much silent debate for Hathaway and his family on the long Martian nights. This night, one of the violent Martian dust storms had come over the low Martian graveyards, blowing through ancient towns and tearing away the plastic walls of the newer American-built city that was melting down into the sand, desolated. The storm abated. Hathaway went out into the cleared weather to see Earth burning green on the windy sky. He put his hand up as one might reach to adjust a dimly burning globe in the ceiling of a dark room. He looked across the long dead sea bottoms. Not another living thing on this entire planet, he thought. Just myself. And them. He looked back within the stone hut. What was happening on Earth now? He had seen no visible sign of change in Earth's aspect through his 30-inch telescope. Well, he thought, I'm good for another 20 years if I'm careful. Someone might come, either across the Dead Seas or out of space in a rocket on a little thread of red flame. He called into the hut. I'm going to take a walk. All right, his wife said. He moved quietly down through a series of ruins. Made in New York, he read from a piece of metal as he passed. And all these things from Earth will be gone long before the old Martian towns. He looked toward the 50 centuries old village that lay among the blue mountains. He came to a solitary Martian graveyard, a series of small hexagonal stones on a hill swept by the lonely wind. He stood looking down at 4 graves with crude wooden crosses on them and names. Tears did not come to his eyes. They had dried long ago. "Do you forgive me for what I've done?" he asked of the crosses. "I was very much alone. You do understand, don't you?" He returned to the stone hut and once more, just before going in, shaded his eyes, searching the black sky. "You keep waiting and waiting and looking," he said, "and one night, perhaps—" There was a tiny red flame on the sky. He stepped away from the light of the hut. "And you look again?" he whispered. The tiny red flame was still there. "It wasn't there last night," he whispered. He stumbled and fell, picked himself up, ran behind the hut, swiveled the telescope, and pointed it at the sky. A minute later, after a long, wild staring, he appeared in the low door of the hut. The wife and the 2 daughters and the son turned their heads to him. Finally, he was able to speak. I have good news," he said. "I have looked at the sky. A rocket is coming to take us all home. It will be here in the early morning." He put his hands down and put his head into his hands and began to cry gently. He burned what was left of New York that morning at 3. He took a torch and moved into the plastic city, and with the flame touched the walls here or there. The city bloomed up in great tosses of heat and light. It was a square mile of illumination, big enough to be seen out in space. It would beckon the rocket down to Mr. Hathaway and his family. His heart beating rapidly with pain, he returned to the hut. "See?" He held up a dusty bottle into the light. "Wine I saved just for tonight. I knew that someday someone would find us. We'll have a drink to celebrate." He poured 5 glasses full. And that's where I'm going to stop for tonight, because I don't want to get too much further into the story, since I may have to start it all over again. So, with that, and let me just double check something here. And I see Sandra showed up. Hello, Sandra, and hello, Dirk. And I think I got everybody. Roja Langenhof. Good to see you too. And with that, I will leave things until later today. Well, this evening, whatever you want to call it, depending on what part of the world you're in. Meanwhile, I am going to wrap it up, but it is nice to be back with you. I hope you all understand I was doing you a favor, not subjecting you to Tad's amazing exploding face. It's bad enough just when it's normal. Trust me, you don't want to see it erupting into weird tick allergy blooms. It's just not pleasant. Anyway, but that doesn't matter now. So with a song in my heart and a smile on my lips, and missing but not sad for our beautiful little dog, who is, if there's any justice, is out going tick, 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 somewhere on the other side of the Rainbow Bridge. I will say thank you all for joining me. Take good care of yourselves. Take good care of your friends and loved ones. Don't forget to keep an eye out for the people around you who might need a helping hand or a smile or just somebody to listen to them for a little bit. So whatever the case, though, take good care of yourselves, and I will see you very soon. Peace, and have a good one.